along the way. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Germinator, and I have the pleasure of having my guest today as Scott Stirrett, the founder of Venture for Canada. My name is Alon Eisenstein. I am assistant professor of teaching at the School of Engineering at UBC Okanagan campus. And before I tell you a bit more about my guest for today, Scott, I do want to start by acknowledging that the land on which I am sitting in my office and welcoming my guest Scott is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded and currently occupied territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. And I always like to acknowledge the land by referencing to a something that I've learned as an uninvited guest to the territory that is relevant to the topic of our discussion today. And honestly, thinking about Scott's going to tell us about life wisdom for young people and how to navigate through life. I can't not think of the stories of Coyote. And in the Insiltial language, his name is Sinclip. And Sinclip is one of the many ways in which the Syilx pass knowledge and wisdom from generation to generation and help teach the young generation of the wisdom of previous generation and how to lead good life in a good way with themselves, with community, in a world, whether it's changing or staying put. And so I think Scott would appreciate a lot of the stories that Sinclair is involved with. Um, and some of them are funny and some of them are a bit morbid, but they all teach you wisdom. Specifically on Scott, for those of you who didn't have a time to do your homework and prep before coming today, so Scott is from Dartmouth, Nova Scotia originally. He is a graduate of Georgetown's Walsh School of Foreign Service. He was a Goldman Sachs employee, and then he became the founder of Venture for Canada. That's a national charity. It's supporting over 10,000 young people to learn and develop entrepreneurial skills through internships with startups across Canada. And since 2013, when it was founded, Scott was able to raise over $80 million, partner with major founders, Employment and Social Development Canada, RBC Foundation, and TD Bank. And I guess the list is actually much longer than that, but these are the main ones. And Scott has also been recognized as a TELUS LGBTQ Innovator of the Year and an Ashoka Fellow. For those of you who are not familiar with Ashoka Foundation, I encourage you to check out their website. They also do great work as well. I think currently you're still co-chairing the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights. Yeah, and on the board of the Speech and Debate Canada Foundation. And the topic for today, The Uncertainty Advantage, is a book that he has recently authored and published, The Uncertainty Advantage, a guide for young people, professionals navigating today's rapidly changing world. And we'll talk about the 6 pillars for thriving in a changing world. Scott, so good to have you today. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me here today.
Um, why don't we start by maybe just your personal experience? And, I was kind of reading through the book and there's so many personal stories and so many um, things you learned along the way, the hard way, mostly. Um, can you give us a brief synopsis? So I kind of glanced through all the way from, getting hired by Goldman Sachs and then now have retired from from Venture for Canada. Um, what has been your trajectory from all the way from school to today in a few kind of large hops and skips?
Yeah, absolutely. After growing up in Nova Scotia, I went to Georgetown University, and after Georgetown, I got a job at Goldman Sachs, and I worked at Goldman Sachs for around a year. And when I was at Goldman Sachs, I started building Venture for Canada on the side. And around a year in, I realized that Venture for Canada really could be like a potentially, significant national institution. And I decided to leave my job and to go move to Canada. And I moved to Toronto, where I never lived before and really knew virtually no one, and started building the organization. And in that time, we Went through lots of ups and downs. I at times have loved uncertainty, like when I left Goldman Sachs to go create a not-for-profit that had no budget. But at other times, I have really disliked uncertainty. During the pandemic, I was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder and went through a really significant mental health challenge for a period of around 6 months where it was particularly acute. And at the core, obsessive compulsive disorder is a fear of uncertainty. And while most people don't have OCD, many people have a fear of uncertainty. So my own personal experience with uncertainty motivated me to write this book, but also the fact that I've seen in the context of my work at Venture for Canada that so many other people struggle with uncertainty, particularly young people. And I wish a book like The Uncertainty Advantage existed when I was a young person and had challenges navigating an uncertain world.
That's so true. And I find it's really, a common theme I hear from people, especially authors like yourself that say, I wish I had my book when I was that age. Um, Before we talk about the six pillars, and they're all really great, great pillars to rely on. Um, when you say uncertainty, and kind of thinking through the span of, all the way from, 2013 or even 2010, when you were going into the Goldman Sachs or transitioning into the workforce, all the way for 2025. So we're talking a span of about, a decade, just over a decade. Um, is uncertainty a new thing? Have you seen it always there? Is it different today than it was 10 years ago? How do you see uncertainty?
I think uncertainty has existed with us since like the dawn of humanity. Like we've always had to live with uncertainty. But what's different about right now is that we're living in an era where there is more rapid change than I think ever before. There's a thing called the World Uncertainty Index that measures the level of uncertainty in the world. And that index shows that the level of uncertainty today is around 5 times higher than it was in early 2008. So if you feel like the world is more uncertain, it is objectively. And while, throughout human history, there's been uncertainty. What's different now is the pace of change. So AI, climate change, political instability. But in particular, I'd say zooming into like technological change and climate change. Those are two things I think unique to our era. There's been other eras where there's been lots of political instability. But we're now in a situation where AI and other technologies are emerging so quickly and at such a high pace that it is challenging for people to keep up. Because those technologies impact the way that we live, the way that we work. And then when you take into account climate change, which is also a relatively new phenomenon that we are also coping with, we're living in a world that is not just uncertain, but it's changing really quickly. And that's, I think, what makes this specific moment in time particularly unique for a lot of young people.
Okay. I could not agree more. Um, my last question, and then I promise we'll go to the six pillars. Why young professionals? I mean, don't old. I mean, I don't count myself as old, but maybe older. Um, our young professionals have a unique, uh, you know, place in in how you see the world of uncertainty, or is it because, again, you're kind of talking to yourself from the last 10 years that is your focus of your attention?
Yeah, I think that it's a really good question. I think we all grapple with uncertainty at every point in our lives. And I think one could write a book about uncertainty for other age groups. The reason I decided to choose young people were a couple reasons. One is that I have a lot of experience supporting people in their 20s and 30s, and I feel like I can write a book for that kind of audience. Two is that I'm kind of at the end of that time period myself, so it's fresh and I can share personal stories that I think are hopefully relatable to folks. And the third point that I think is important in the context of just like writing a book is that it's important for books, I think, to be focused on a specific like audience. In some ways, a book becomes more useful the more clear the target reader is. So while I think that Uncertainty Advantage can be valuable for parents, it can be valuable for educators, it can be valuable for people at many different ages, the audience I wrote for were people in their 20s. But indirectly, I do think that there's a lot of other age groups and audiences that the book seems to resonate with too.
Yeah. I can speak from my experience reading the book. Lots of things really resonated with even my daily existence right now as a professor at the university. Um, okay, so six pillars. Should we go through one of them one at a time, or do you want to just give us the big picture and then we'll kind of dig into one of them or all of them in sequence?
Yeah, I'm happy. I can mention the six very briefly, and then we
Okay.
can dive in. But yeah, the six pillars of the certainty advantage are first, the importance of self-compassion, essentially being kind to yourself. The second is the importance of adaptability, essentially not holding too firm to any kind of plans that you have. Three is the importance of anti-fragility, building your risk-taking muscles, putting yourself in uncomfortable situations. Four is the importance of general skills, skills that can still be important in an AI era. Five, entrepreneurial mindset, the ability to identify and act upon opportunities, and the importance of an entrepreneurial mindset for everyone, not just for entrepreneurs. And the sixth and final pillar is the importance of network building, which is that in a world of a lot of chaos, but also a lot of opportunity, who you know is really important for both fostering resilience, but also in terms of being able to find opportunities. And the six pillars of the uncertainty advantage are intended to be a menu. It's not this list of, oh, these are the 100 things you need to do to survive uncertainty. But I really encourage people to think around what pillars or what aspects of advice resonate the most with them, and then to carry that forward. Because I don't do every single thing that I say in the uncertainty advantage, just because there's a lot of pieces of advice in there. But the goal is to give people a lot of tools and then let people choose which tools are the most helpful for them.
Right. And I will say that one thing that I really liked about the framing when you kind of put the introduction for the book is that the six pillars are meant to be seen as holistic and you need a balanced life in a way that makes sense and not just over double down on one more so than the rest and then you become overly obsessed or troubled by one over the rest. So I like that messaging on balancing. Um, before I see if anybody wants to ask any question about whether your personal experience or the pillars, can you give us maybe um, any of the six? What would be a one of your favorite stories about your personal experience that you mentioned in the book that explains what it means to you, like one of the six pillars?
I'd say the story that seems like it resonates the most often is the self-compassion pillar. And my experience of getting diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder during the pandemic. And I had a really low point where I went out of my house in like the middle of March and it was like 4 a.m. and I was Googling about a bunch of illnesses and doing kind of compulsive behavior when I was in the midst of treatment and knew I shouldn't have done it. And that was a really like low point for me of just feeling really angry at myself. I hadn't been sleeping. I was in a really bad mental health state and really struggling to kind of function. And what I learned about that kind of sort of that situation was the importance of not beating up on myself or blaming myself for having OCD or just being just very unkind to myself, but rather that it's important to speak to yourself in like a gentle like way because when you're just extremely demanding and relentless on yourself or you blame everything on you. I think it can really limit your resilience and your ability to tolerate uncertainty because if you expect like perfection of yourself in the world, then you're not going to go very far in an uncertain world because an uncertain world is a very imperfect world, and the world's always been imperfect. And I think accepting our flaws and having compassion for ourselves is something that that story I think is an important one to share because one of my goals in doing this book is not to say, oh, here, this is all examples of why I'm so amazing and I've done such a good job at dealing with uncertainty. It's actually to say that teach what you most need to learn. And I every day need to build my own uncertainty muscles. And this book is in some of ways perhaps a part of my own journey of continuing to be more comfortable with uncertainty.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm kind of thinking about there's an old saying, or maybe it's not that old. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of good,
Yeah.
right? Um, but I feel like when you say self-compassion, you mean on a much more deeper and personal level than simply, good enough and move on, right? You're really asking about or kind of reflecting on being overly judgmental in a way that's unfair to yourself.
Yeah, totally. And in the book, I talk about there's three different definitions of self-compassion. The first is the importance of being kind to yourself and essentially talking to yourself like you would talk to a friend. The second is the importance of being mindful of just how you're feeling and your emotions. And the third is recognizing your shared humanity and that other people in the world are probably going through the same challenge. And that when you do that and you begin to kind of foster more of that empathy and sort of understanding and connect your pain with that of other people, all of those things can make you feel more kind to yourself. And the concept of self-compassion, it's important to give a shout out to Dr. Kristen Neff, who popularized the concept and is the one who kind of broke self-compassion into the three categories I just mentioned.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to put a pause here and see if anybody of our listeners, and there's a nice mix of our students and faculty and staff and a few community partners that I know. If anybody wants to ask any question of Scott about his experience, the book, what we just heard about being self-compassion. Yes, Ladan, please.
Uh, Hi, Scott. Thank you for sharing your experience. Um, I correct me if I'm wrong, but you mentioned the uncertainty muscle. If I heard that correctly, can you just elaborate on that and even like a story that you realize that you need to build some sort of a skill to deal with to move on with and accepting the uncertainty.
Yeah, absolutely. Essentially, I believe that we can all choose to develop better relationships with uncertainty. And I've seen firsthand at some points in my life where I have loved uncertainty, and there's other moments in my life where I haven't liked it. And even in a given day, my relationship with uncertainty can ebb and flow. And that's okay. I the important point is that we can all build our uncertainty muscles, and uncertainty muscles is the ability to cope and to thrive with uncertainty. Essentially, are you someone who goes out in your life to seek out uncertain situations, who likes uncertainty? And I've now done, probably close to 25 or 30 talks about the uncertainty advantage. And often I'll ask audiences this question of raise your hand if you if you dislike uncertainty, and raise your hand if you love uncertainty. And generally, there's four or five people who say they dislike uncertainty for every one person who says that they like uncertainty. So we all need to build our uncertainty muscles all the time. And I am a genuine believer that even if you're someone who hates uncertainty today, you can learn gradually over time to like uncertainty a lot more.
Mehdi, do you have a question?
Yeah, actually, so hello, Scott. Thank you for sharing that. I have a question that I would like to form kind of another connections when we have uncertainty and FOMO and the self-compassion. So how you see the connection between these three? And the FOMO always happen to entrepreneurs, right? So uncertainty maybe is gonna make it worse. Sometimes self-compassion is gonna help me, or how do you see that?
So it's self-compassion and then
Fear of missing out,
fear
FOMO,
of FOMO.
and uncertainty.
Yeah, I think, I mean, fear of missing out can be a huge challenge that I think, in particular, a lot of young people deal with, and something I can struggle. I think that where that fear, FOMO can link with uncertainty, is that when you don't know what's going to be like ahead of you, you're kind of start to like constantly get in this mindset of thinking of optimizing. And I think a lot of people can get into this over optimizing. So they're constantly thinking, oh, what's the absolute best thing that I can do in this situation? And I see that even sometimes where people will be like, well, I need to go to the best restaurant. I need to go to the best coffee shop, like even like if they're on vacation and people just start to try to over optimize like everything in their lives. And yeah, I think sometimes they do that to the extent that they're trying to minimize uncertainty. What I would encourage as a little thing that someone can do to build up their uncertainty muscles is like go to a restaurant and like don't check the reviews. Go, book a trip and like maybe book the hotel rooms or even potentially book a trip and just like don't really have an itinerary. To be fair, I don't do that, but I do have a trip booked coming up and I book the hotels, but I don't really know what I'm going to do on all the days. Like I know like because yeah, it's I think reasonable often to book hotels because things do get booked up. But to not be like, okay, these are the 20 things I'm going to do every day. It's to sort of embrace the unknown. And I think when you do those little things, they might seem small, but they can add up because it all of those things increase your capacity, your willingness to embrace uncertain situations.
That's so true. And it's funny how the thought of going to a restaurant without checking their review seems outrageously risky at this moment in time, right? Um, why don't we go to a different pillar? And I'm particularly curious about the one that's anti-fragility.
Yeah.
And I recently actually was visiting Toronto, and I was actually in a conference on engineering leadership, and the topic of anti-fragility came up. Um, so for the benefit of our guests and our audience, um, what is anti-fragility, and how is it different from being simply resilient?
Anti-fragility is the ability to not just tolerate disorder, but actually to benefit from it. And an anti-fragile person thrives in chaos, actually becomes like better. And the concept it comes from Nassim Taleb, who is a famous investing finance professor. Great book that he wrote. And the one of the ways that you can foster anti-fragility in your life is to put yourself in situations where you're out of your comfort zone. And it's important to acknowledge, as I do in the book, that we all have different like socioeconomic statuses. It's easier to take risks and to build that kind of anti-fragility if you have access to more socioeconomic advantages or more of like a social safety net. But regardless of where someone's starting from, everyone can work to build their anti-fragility kind of muscles. And one of the reasons I put this chapter here, and I think self-compassion and anti-fragility, I think in many ways are the two chapters that it seems like resonate the most with people, or the two pillars, is that anti-fragility is important because I think a lot of people sometimes think that like what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. And I think it's important in an era of uncertainty to say that it's important to challenge yourself. It's important to be kind to yourself, yes. Self-compassion is really important. But you're not actually being kind to yourself if you don't push yourself out of your comfort zone. And part of pushing yourself out of your comfort zone is taking risks in your life.
Yeah. And I was going to build on that and say the metaphor that I heard in the context of anti-fragility is how do you build muscle, right? If you go to the gym to work out, you have to essentially tear the muscle tissue for it to rebuild stronger. But if you never tear it, if you don't stretch it to the limit, then nothing is going to get rebuilt. You're just stayed within the same limited capacity of the muscle tissue you had before.
Totally. Yeah, I think the analogy is like spot on and it applies to everything in life. There's a famous line that's often quoted where it's like tough times create tough people. Stable times, tough times create tough people, stable times can create weak people. And I think that there, is a case to be made for that. Like you look at a lot of people who have gone through significant hardships earlier in their lives, and then what they end up accomplishing. I don't think it's always, there's a reason. Is it's because um, challenge does breed, I think, resilience, and ultimately beyond that, it breeds like the ability to actually like thrive and seek out chaos and to see the opportunity in the chaos rather than just the fear of it.
Kind of building on that idea, there's a sentence in your book that caught my attention. And I don't know if you can tell me if this is aligned with this idea of being challenged and tough time creates tougher people. Um, you write, it's no coincidence that only a few months after coming out, I founded Venture for Canada. Can you tell us a bit about that and why do you think that it's not a coincidence?
Yeah, coming out of the closet was directly linked to my comfort in taking more risks. It was something that had been weighing on me for a long, time. And coming out of the closet was one of the more challenging things that I've like done in my life, especially at that time. And I had so much shame and fear, and then eventually when I started to tell people that I was gay, there was a sense of just feeling, oh, that I was really scared about that, but it actually wasn't that scary. My world didn't like end in coming out of the closet. And it's funny sometimes now thinking back on it, like, I mean, it was a little different time too, but in, 2013 in coming out, it was, or sorry, 2013. Um, I thought that like the world was going to end, and now it's something where it's I'm married, and it feels like that was like a whole like lifetime away. Uh, but shortly after coming out, I then worked at Goldman Sachs, and then I think that coming out made me feel more comfortable in terms of the authenticity of like who I am, but also in terms of my comfort, like taking risks and embracing my like authentic self. So I came out of the closet for the first time in like February 2013, and I incorporated Venture for Canada in like June 2013. So there really is not that long of a distance in time between those two events.
Yeah. And I really appreciate how, in many of the examples in the book, you're really weaving what looks like two different or many different aspects of your life, and they're all kind of somehow merged together into, as a story is like, well, that's my life story, but it makes sense in hindsight, but somehow in the moment they feel potentially not necessarily connected to each other. Um, I wonder, when somebody's listening to you, right? And I'm assuming you're going on a book tour now and you're telling people about the book. Which story, you said there's one story that kind of resonates most with people, but which story do you want people that you carry the most connection to, that's the most important to you, that you want people to hear?
I think that coming out story is the one that would be the most like emotionally re yeah, I'd say probably that's one that I think for me is very emotionally resonant. The OCD one, candidly, both are very important, but I think that the coming out one, yeah, the coming out story is probably the one that I would most want to tell because I think that I mean it links to so many things: authenticity, risk taking, embracing like the unknown. Uh, and I think for me, yeah, it's just a very emotionally like resonant story. The OCD one is too. I think perhaps the only thing I would say to wrap this up is that I've spoken a lot more about the OCD experience, I think, in other talks and interviews. So I think that I, in some ways, am more at this specific moment in time, I'm more passionate talking about the coming out story because I feel like I've talked about it. Well, I've talked about it a little bit less than the OCD one. And I think that the coming out story is also like core to the narrative of the book and core to why I wrote The Uncertainty Advantage.
Yeah. And I think from you telling the story about the OCD and now the story of coming out as gay, I think there's the theme of self-acceptance and saying it out loud is really monumental in so many ways. Um, Maybe I'll put a pause here and see if anybody wants to ask any question about this part of the story. No? Okay. So why don't we go to maybe a third pillar? Um, Maybe one that's, I don't know if you meant to be contentious or um, thought-provoking, but the idea of being a generalist.
Yeah.
And I think in the age of AI, we're being challenged at what will you be hired for, you know? And as an educator, it is essentially my job to help people become specialized. From being a high school graduate, they come into university. I teach at the engineering program, so you leave with a profession, and you can still be a general engineer, but the reality is most engineering programs are more specialized than that. So you're already carved into a subspecialty of engineering, and the specialization is just increasing by the year. Um, so what is the counter argument? What is the counter argument that yes, you need to specialize to do certain things, but the generalist part of you should not be sacrificed or thrown out on the bus?
I I think that it's the context of the times that we live in right now. And it's that we're in an era where AI is going after, I think, a lot of technical skills. And in the relative balance of technical versus generalist skills, skills are still going to be important for many things. But I think the relative importance of technical skills is going to go down. And it's because AI is going to go kind of from profession to profession and eat, I think, a lot of the technical skills. Not all, but many. And we're already seeing that with software engineering, like significantly less junior software engineers are being hired right now than last than 2 or 3 years ago. And I think you're going to see that across accounting, across a lot of like civil engineering, like a variety of kind of technical domains. So then, like, where does that leave us in terms of the skills that are still important? It is those ones like communications, collaboration, the ability to focus that I think are going to be the skills that are still important even in an era of AI. And I also think that there will be more reluctance from people to become deeply specialized in specific subjects because there will be fear that AI is going, like, there's a risk that any deeply technical domain could get automated. So there's a question I think a lot of people will have of, well, why become a deep specialist when there's a risk that AI is going to come and significantly disrupt that domain. So people are kind of making bets in their careers. I think you're going to see people make more bets to say, okay, I want to have some technical skills, but I'm really going to invest more in my generalist skills. Because I'm a betting person, I think that those generalist skills are likely to be more enduring and less likely to be disrupted than the technical ones.
And so if you had to um, kind of teasing out the question of balance, um, where do you think we are right now in this moment of time of evolution? Um, and I want to maybe kind of tighten my question because I think it's not fair to ask globally, but because the focus of the book is for young people, right? And I think young people do tend to overemphasize being a specialist over generalist. So I would say, on average, a young person, a young professional assumes they need to be, on average, more towards a specialist than a generalist. So definitely more than a 50-50, maybe even a 80-20. Um, in the jobs that we're seeing now being disrupted, like, software developer or potentially coming close to, accounting and stuff, are we rebalancing it to a 50-50 split, or is being a generalist now the majority of the skill set that you think are needed?
I think right now specialist skills are still really important. I mean, the future, the who knows what the future, but I would say maybe 5, 10 years from now, we could have a world where the generalist skills are significantly more important than right now. I don't think we're quite there yet, though, alone, but I think we're in that kind of general trajectory, and I think it will take some time. But I think that gradually you will see general skills more and more important across like most jobs. In some ways, I think too, we could have a return of more of like liberal arts education, where you have more of an emphasis on the ability to integrate knowledge, maybe to specialize, but also that there'll be more of like people reading the great books and like and kind of deeply understanding across a variety of like domains,
Hmm.
which was something that existed through a lot of recent human history. But in the last like 50 years, especially last like maybe 30, 40 years, there's been a significant decline in that.
Yeah. And definitely kind of thinking about the term, a PhD is a doctor of philosophy doctorate, and this idea of having a broad, deep knowledge of ability to be philosophical about your program, and which I think we kind of lost that ability, and we're expecting people to be tighter and tighter in their understanding and not deeper and wider at the same time. Um, this ties really nicely to, I think the last is number six. Yeah, like the last pillar. And you talk about building a strong network. And I like to talk to students about this concept of social capital. What does that mean? And again, the networking effect and whatnot. Um, so is it who you know as opposed to what you know that people need to rebalance their expectation. I heard people kind of say, but doesn't that mean that's favoritism, that you can be hired unqualified hired because of who you know, but you really shouldn't be getting the job? Is that the takeaway that people should take from this idea, or is it something that is misunderstood about the power of networks?
There's a line in the book where I say that your ability to handle not knowing is more important than what you know. But we could also say increasingly your ability to handle, or your ability or who you know is more important than what you know. And I do think that that is like that is an important point. And I think people need to recognize how the world actually is. And that is to say, who you know shapes so much of your career trajectory and your outcomes in life. And whether that's fair or not, people can make points on. But what's the reality of the world for young people today? Is who you know shapes your job opportunities, your career opportunities, your advice. There's the famous line that we're the average of the 5 people we spend the most time with, our expectations. And we all have, as I mentioned, different socioeconomic like starting points. And some people start on third base and some people start way before that. And it is important for everyone, regardless of where they're starting at, to think about how can they grow their personal network and how can they build a network that helps them in terms of their resilience, but also helps them in terms of ultimately learning to embrace the opportunity in uncertainty.
I can't agree more. You're preaching to the choir in my case. Um, before I ask you about, um, I think it's the last pillar, which is the entrepreneurial mindset, um, which is also what I teach. So that's close to home. Um, I do want to give people the last chance to ask any questions or comments. And I know we're kind of jumping along the pillars, so there's so much to talk about in each thread. Nobody's itching for a question, I see. Okay. So back to my favorite topic, entrepreneurial mindset. Um, and from a literature point of view, that's a very lively debate about whether entrepreneurial thinking and entrepreneurial skills are contained just for entrepreneurs, what does it look like if you're not an entrepreneur? And would you still be calling it entrepreneurial mindset if you're not actually being entrepreneurial? Um, so maybe kind of what do you mean when you say people need to embrace, adopt an entrepreneurial mindset, and why is it important?
I think first important to define what means to be entrepreneurial. And to be entrepreneurial is to identify and act upon opportunities to create value for others. And entrepreneurial skills can include the ability to spot opportunities, to action on ideas. And everyone can be entrepreneurial. And it's not just founders. It could be government employees. It could be someone working in a startup. I think it's important to note that in a world of rapid change, and rapid change means that there are in many ways more opportunities than ever before, that everyone needs to have this entrepreneurial mindset. And I think it can be really limiting when people define on being entrepreneurial as purely about being like a founder, because we all can be entrepreneurial in many different ways, and that doesn't just mean starting a business.
What would it look like? So if somebody tells you, well, how do you know somebody that has or doesn't have an entrepreneurial mindset? And again, maybe kind of putting aside being a founder. So I think all the venture founders, that's a no-brainer. Yeah, they're entrepreneurial. They started a company. But all the other people, what should we be looking for, and what should we be role modeling for others?
Yeah, that could be going and raising your hand in a class presentation or in a class, and when you tend to not when you tend not to ask questions. That could be launching creating a painting when you've never done that before. That could be launching a side hustle where you have TikTok videos that you make on like a specific like niche topic. That could be you working in a company and you decide to pitch a new idea within the company. There are so many different ways that people can be entrepreneurial, and those are just a few of them.
Or starting a bi-weekly guest speaker series to bring somebody who wrote a book about it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Um, Ladan, I see you're unmuted. I don't know if you have a question or comment you want to make.
Oh, no, that was a mistake actually. But I'm curious to, I was thinking about in the concepts of entrepreneurship. It's undeniable fact that you need to, because I think it's that you are a curious person by heart and you want to solve a problem. And uncertainty, as you said, it's undeniable as well, and it's everywhere. But in terms of like risk associated with the mistakes that you're gonna make during, like, it's nice to build the uncertainty muscle. It's necessary to move in the path, except for those tiny daily routines, like going to a restaurant that without looking at the reviews. In the entrepreneurship journey, what kind of like low risk activities you suggest to build the uncertainty muscle?
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, I think it can look differently for every person, but I'd say some good examples would be going to launch like a side hustle, like a little side business or venture. Like that could be like making pies and like selling them. Like it doesn't need to be something that's super significant, but that's an example of building. Something that's come up in a lot of the different sessions I've been doing have been solo travel. So that could be going to a different location and traveling by yourself. A lot of people have said that that's one of the most empowering things that they've done in their lives. So I think that's a good example of building uncertainty muscles. I'd say another one would be maybe taking a class in an area you don't know very much about, like if you're a university student. Like, what's important though to note is that it's around figuring out in your context what's something that puts you out of your comfort zone, that helps you build your risk-taking muscles. And a lot of the times, those are also entrepreneurial things. You're identifying an opportunity and you're ultimately acting on it.
Yeah. And this reminds me, I don't know if you're familiar with Malcolm Gladwell's book, Talking to Strangers. The fact that we so resist the urge to talk to strangers when we're commuting or walking down the street. We're just in line. But there's something really empowering about willing to open your mouth and talk to a perfect stranger and have a conversation. And that in itself is kind of taking that risk and
Well,
embracing it.
yeah, it's come up a lot actually in some of the talks I've done. Is people like I've asked the question to people of what's something you can do to that gets you out of your comfort zone, and often people will bring up talking to strangers. And for many of us, it is a big uh, element of jumping out of our comfort zone. And it relates to the network building pillar too, because I think the more that you talk to strangers, the more that you're comfortable building relationships with new people.
Yeah, that's so true. I'm mindful of the time, and we're getting close to the hour, so I just want to um, maybe wrap it up back to the idea that you started with, which is you wrote the book that you wished you had when you were starting off. Um, one of the things that the reason, maybe the core reason I created the Germinator series is to celebrate the moments when things are below the surface, that we don't see what's happening internally and the internal conflict of should I do it or should I not do it, resisting the urge of taking a risk. And then before the world knows, there's that moment when it's very introspective. Um, and I felt like that statement, I wrote the book for myself at that age, kind of resonated with the idea of the Germinator. That why I felt having this space is so important. Um, so maybe can you tell us what is it that you felt was missing in that time where, again, you kind of talk about working for Goldman Sachs, realizing how kind of disconnected you were from the work and inspired to create Venture for Canada. What was that space for? What was missing that you think you would have benefited from having this book with you then?
Yeah, a few different things. One is, I think, just more healthy coping mechanisms for how to navigate like anxiety. I think when I think back to that time in much of my 20s, I was a very anxious person. And I can still be anxious now, but I think I'm a lot more like laid back and relaxed today than I was back then. I think that's partially kind of through different OCD coping mechanisms that I have learned. But it's also things like some of the things I lacked at that time was the like it's okay to not know. And that sometimes the more that you seek knowledge, the answer to something or certainty, the more that you make yourself vulnerable to the uncertainty of the world. So I think that was probably maybe the most fundamental thing I was lacking is that I sought certainty in everything, and I didn't understand that that actually weakened me. It made me less able to navigate the uncertainty that was going on in my life. There's other elements too, like self-compassion that I think I lacked at that time. Other things I think I was actually pretty good at that time, like network building and entrepreneurial mindset. But if I was to say there's something I was lacking was sort of the the comfort with uncertainty and the compassion for myself and to not be so hard and relentless on myself.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That's great. That again, kind of being reflective in hindsight and through the book, it's really empowering, and I appreciate that you're sharing this with us today. Um, Anybody wants to ask last call for questions or comments before I thank our guests for today?
I have a question. I was just wondering about models. Like, did you have someone in your life that was modeling these types of behaviors, or do you think that some of it was because you didn't necessarily have access to models who were natural conversation starters or entrepreneurially, kind of mindset forward?
I
Did
had
that impact at all?
Yeah, I had a lot of like really great entrepreneurial role models, and my dad, my grandfather, others. I think what sometimes I lacked was just like some of that broader support on comfort with uncertainty and just like managing kind of like I think I grew up in a place and maybe a context that was like really highly ambitious. And I think that that drove me to be very ambitious and hardworking. But I think that I sometimes maybe, including in my schooling through Georgetown and other places, there was often a lot of emphasis in the educational institutions and the broader environments that was on like success and like winning, but there wasn't very much emphasis on like balance and like compassion and some other attributes. And if I was to look back on my life, I think the some of these environments that I was in maybe made me be extremely relentless on myself. I think that that didn't just come from nowhere. That we're products of our environment, and I think a lot of young people can be perfectionists today because there's a lot of pressure to be a perfectionist. And I don't blame anyone for the perfectionism. I think it's a consequence of broader social expectations.
I do agree with that. When I've worked in a lot more student-facing roles, student support roles, cooperative education, there was, a lot of rhetoric from students about, you know, pushing forward and what success looked like, where kind of omitting some of the laddering or scaffolding that it took to get there. And why I love the topic of these conversations, where it is what's bubbling up underneath the surface too, because a lot of times some people look like everything is just going so well, but you don't understand all the ladders and the setbacks and the rebounds that it took to actually propel forward. And I think that's that journey of like the get back up after you've fallen down or had experienced a setback, or like resiliency is often minimized and the end result is overemphasized.
Yeah, agreed. I think we can often, as a society, focus way more on the outcomes rather than on the destination. Or sorry, way more on the outcomes than on the journey. And yeah, we don't control outcomes. We only control the journey.
Yeah, that's so true. And in that note, I think I can control the time for this session. Um, so the little wins. I do want to thank Scott again, and again remind people that we were talking about the uncertainty advantage, and that's a newly published book by Scott himself. And I enjoyed reading it, and I really appreciated the opportunity to have this conversation with you today. Um, my next guest will be Calvin Cheng, and he is currently working with Lumotive, and he will talk about going from the lab bench to global market, the lessons in scaling deep tech hardware startups. Calvin is an old friend from the time when I was at the University of Toronto, and he has a wealth of experience working as a founder, and building a company and scaling it, and then moving on and building a team in a already scaled up and fast growing company. And that would be the topic of our conversation in 2 weeks, roughly, yeah, November 4th. So I invite everybody to join us on this next conversation with Calvin. And so, Scott, it has been a truly pleasure to have a chat with you on your book. And I'm so grateful that you wrote the book, and the message that you're sharing with young professionals, that they definitely need to hear about being self-compassionate and embracing uncertainty as opposed to trying to avoid it or control it. That's very timely, especially at a time of mass disruption for workforce, the environment, the climate. The political landscape is just unraveling in front of our very own eyes, which is, as a non-young professional, is unnerving to me. I can only imagine young professionals needing to see this as the beginning of their professional life being overwhelming. So thank you again.
Thanks so much for having me.
Have a good rest of the day, everyone, and hope to see you in future Germinator sessions. Bye for now.